great. Relationships at work. And, I wanted to keep it really open. So, you could look at relationships at work in general. I was thinking along the lines of exploring how relationships at work have changed as a result of COVID, both in your world and in the world of your clients. I'm really open to hear from you what's important for you and what interpretation you have of relationships at work. So, how should we do this? We're quite a small group, so we can actually have a group discussion and identify some themes and then go off into smaller groups and build up those things a little bit more. Would that work for you as a process? So why are you here? What did you want to hear about? Yes, Sabine, hi. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, I'm just raising my hand here because this is my very first time checking into this space.
Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Julia. I'm very new to Aephoria. I'm planning to take the Enneagram Level 1 course later this year. So yeah, I'm here. I love the opportunity that you have with public supervision where people can just join. So yeah, I'm here with a lot of curiosity, very open-minded, and just I guess for me it's more the setting over the content for today, just figuring out what this is. Yeah, and obviously the topic is very relevant right now for a lot of people. So yeah, I just wanted to say hello and nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Fantastic to have you here. And I'm glad you found the topic relevant. Is there any specific area that you would like to explore?
I think at this point, not necessarily. For me, the vantage point would be to, I mean, I suppose supporting clients if they have issues with the transition that we are experiencing right now. But other than that, I'm quite open. I'm sure that if the discussion starts, I'll kind of just hop on as we go.
That's exactly how we like to roll. Cool, easy, let's see how it progresses. Thank you.
I must admit, it wasn't the COVID thing that came up for me around the topic. So I went to kind of psychological dynamics and how they show up at work. So how we bring in other relationships, the kind of transferential childhood trauma sort of based stuff that we see often in organizations where people turn up expecting to be parented either badly or well or whatever. And then the other thing I went to, which is because there's a particular client case at the moment in an exco team where the presenting problem was dysfunction in the team, and then it transpired only later that there was a relationship happening between the MD and one of the exco members. And there'd been a series of triangles formed, which had been very destructive for the team. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's, yeah, it's quite an interesting system to be working in at the moment.
Yeah. And
so it's that kind of, yeah, the emotional entanglement aspects of relationships at work and how they get in the way maybe of the work.
Nice, nice. Yeah, absolutely. So to the psychological dynamics, transference, and intimate relationships at work.
I think, Julia, tying the reason that particular clip kind of resonated in terms of the topic was COVID included, but that the people in the meeting were reacting to the person leading the meeting in a way that suggested exactly that psychological dynamic of us holding in mind a situation that isn't real and relating to others as if they were the image in our head rather than the person who's actually in front of us. So kind of crossing what Simon's saying and the COVID amusement of it, but how often we begin a relationship exactly that, expecting someone to be what we think they are rather than what they really are or who they really are.
That is really interesting. I watched a whole lot of videos and read bits and bobs here and there to prepare for this. And two things sort of stood out for me. The one was looking, for some of you who've had a look at that work on how humans are used as objects or assets or tools in organizations, and some sort of wondering on my part whether interacting through the gaze of the Zoom lens, for those that know the Jean-Paul Sartre idea of being looked at and how that affects how you behave, how that makes, how that might objectify people more. Exactly as you mentioned, that, less about really engaging with the person and dealing with them in maybe a more objectified way, or even a more kind of projective way, as per Simon's conversation. And then I saw this really funny video that I don't know what to say about it. I don't know, it came from CNN or something. And the lady was arguing that we can be so much more objective when we interact on Zoom. And I don't know what to make of it, but maybe that idea feeds into what you were saying. That somehow there's something which is interfering and it extends beyond the Zoom room. So thank you. Thank you for that. Lee.
So I find it really interesting, in the mix of my client base, how some people actually don't want to go back to work. And being back in the office for many people presents challenges around managing politics. It's been so nice being at home. I haven't had to deal with any of the bitchiness kind of comments.
Yeah.
So there's that. And then the other one, which is, I suppose, not really pandemic related, but it's surfacing quite a lot. And that is, again, more sort of in that gender kind of area where women are becoming in themselves more polarized, and some of the stereotypical stuff of, so men are just so hard to work with, and women on women, and the competition, and actually not being always that kind to each other. So I think those are two themes that I find quite interesting.
Lee, do you think that kind of fits in some way into what Sarah Ann was saying? That okay, I'm translating and I'm winging it, so I haven't a clue, could be wrong. That the Zoom room has interfered into relationships, and we've lost a bit of glue, and we're more likely to view the person as an object, or perhaps a projection object, or possibly even as a competitor.
Yeah, possibly that. And dare I say it, I'm looking at Ingrid, and I think a lot of it has to do with personality. Some people are just more social, and some are more withdrawn. And so I think a lot of people have become very comfortable not having to deal with the messiness of relationships.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I meant to mute.
Thank you. Good. So, okay. There's another sort of, yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering in this situation, because I was struck in the video watching it, and I thought, like, in the face-to-face, in the office context, there's all these rituals of hiding. And in the Zoom context, those rituals are hidden. So rituals like nodding when it guys saying boring stuff and certain politenesses and all sorts of things. So this is almost an anthropological component to it. There's a loss of culture and a loss of all the ways in which human beings are constituted as human beings inside that specific cultural space. A loss is maybe one word, maybe it's a transformation, and we don't actually quite know how yet to deal with what does it mean to be yourself and how you constituted in the relationship in this particular space, etc., etc. Something around that. That's perhaps more anthropological than psychodynamic.
Well, maybe it fits into this broader theme that Sarah Ann raised, and then Lee developed, and Lee had other stuff. But as I'm sort of thinking it might, because it's the loss or adaptation of rituals of connection. You know, ways of being that signal we're together. Like that. I also saw something, if I can just come in here, because it's sort of connected, is on somebody exploring attachment patterns to work. So hopefully lots of you know about attachment patterns, and typically they talk about it, you know, from one's childhood. You have secure attachments, anxious, avoidant, what's the yeah, insecure or secure. That's, maybe just leave it at that. And talking about how those attachment patterns, how they determine one's relationship to work. So if you have like an insecure attachment, you believe you have to do stuff for work to keep kind of engaging with you. And if you have a secure attachment, the theory suggests that you have more independence of thought, and you have a sense you can keep being yourself a little bit more. So there was something on how the Zoom room changes attachment to work, that one's attachment to work somehow lessens. You become less prone to the requirements of work because it is only a laptop. And so your attachments to other things strengthen.
I wonder also, I mean, it might be it probably is a different experience for anxious attachment versus avoidant attachment. So Zoom would serve the avoidance in theory, at least, and maybe make the anxious more anxious because there's less connection, less intimacy.
Thanks, Simon. And maybe you can just fill in where I forgot.
No, I mean, so I work, there's a few different theories, but I work on secure, anxious, avoidant, and then there's also the kind of subset of that which is fearful avoidant.
Yeah.
But there's different ways of working with that. And this crap around 50% of people being securely attached, I don't believe that at all. But that's what the theory says.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just focusing on myself too much.
So, so something around attachment, Liesl, sorry.
So I'm still on why am I here today?
Yeah.
And I'm not linking too much that anybody said. Is that okay?
Yes.
I think there's a very, very big thing to also just acknowledge is there's a lot of cultures where the cameras are never on and the mics are never on. And I'm personally working with a client, and I have been since June last year. I actually happened to meet one of them at a music festival this weekend. It was weird. I was looking at her for 20 minutes thinking, I wonder if it's her, because I've never seen her in real life. But anyway, and their culture is to have cameras off muted. But with all the sessions I've done with them, they know now that the camera has to be on. And the first few times they were like, oh, Pete, it's so nice to see you. Oh my God, you look different. You've got a beard now, blah, 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 blah. But they kept saying how nice it was for them to see each other. And how nice it was to have a session where they had little breakaways and they talked to each other, like, and they could see each other's expressions and body language and stuff like that. But if I'm not there, that those cameras are never, ever on. Every single session we have, they say the camera should be on more. We should at least start every meeting with a check-in for 10 minutes with the cameras on, but they never do. 3 weeks later, I meet them and it's not happening. And there's quite a few of our clients that they work like that. And I think what that has done to relationships in the work is ridiculous. And that makes people feel completely isolated. You know, like that video you showed us, that's the typical culture where your video and your mic's been off for the past 18 months. And if that's not the culture, then, well, personally for me, if I can see people's faces on Zoom, I think I feel better. I feel like I've been with people almost. I facilitated a session in February this year, face-to-face, a team development session. And everybody had their masks on. And I hated that more than a Zoom session. I was so excited for having real people in a room. But I had 11 strangers looking at me with eyes that I don't know. And it was, I really didn't like that. I would prefer a Zoom session with cameras on than an in-person session with masks on. And that also made me think of, anyway, yeah, and this client that I was talking about that I've only seen online, they keep saying the issues in their teams is that they don't talk about personal stuff, they don't check in, they don't talk about emotions and people's fears and anxieties and stuff like that. And they keep saying we should, and they're very senior. They're the leaders of all the teams in this division, and it's not happening. So I wonder if it was easier for team leaders to either ignore or somehow manage real relationships between people, and now it's becoming harder and easier to ignore at the same time.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I like what you're saying. If you work with this idea that Jean-Paul Sartre and Fanon and Biko did, which is humans become objects when you take part of them away, when a bit is amputated, or they become kind of bewitched, but they only bring in the one utilitarian aspect of themselves into the conversation. Then maybe the previous discussion links, because it's always a blocked relationship. There's a mask or a Zoom lens. And then perhaps it's like that abandonment thing, you know, when people pull a little bit of themselves out of a partnership or a team, then typically that triggers abandonment stuff in the team, and then other people pull stuff out too. And slowly that's how it becomes cemented. Maybe that's a conversation. Thank you. Ms. Hurwitz.
I don't know if she's on yet. She wrote in the chat that she'll be here in 10.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, sorry, I didn't read. Any other comments that you would like to add, or possible subjects? Kim and Aileen, whichever one wants to roll first.
Kim, you're welcome to go first. Okay. Yeah, something I found quite interesting is how working online has been an opportunity for people to build relationships through being exposed to each other's sort of normal life more. You know, people are meeting each other's kids and so on. And something that I became aware of in the early parts of lockdown was, especially me with my 9 style, really kind of promoting that, you know. And then one of my clients was like, actually, I'm feeling really uncomfortable about sharing my personal life with my working team. And she was talking about how for her it's important to have that divide between work and personal life, and she really doesn't like this kind of people, her working team being in her personal space. And I was caught quite off guard with that, I think because of my 9 glasses. But yeah, I thought maybe that could be an interesting thing to discuss, is this sort of balance between really encouraging relationships, but at the same time respecting those boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a boundary thing. Hey? Boundaries are horrible things. So thank you, Kim. So some sort of boundary thing, yeah. And Aileen?
Yeah, sorry, I did join late, so I apologize. But it was something that Christu said that kind of just sparked something. In my personal situation, I joined a company in the middle of lockdown, so I haven't met half of, I think even 3/4 of my department. I've only technically met my team, which consists of maybe 3 or 4 that I work closely with, and I maybe have sort of met informally based on other meetings, let's say like 10 people, and we're a department of over 60. So something I'm struggling with is we're going slowly back into the office, hybrid approach, and I see people recognizing me and I have no idea who anybody is. And also, organizing of retirement parties or birthdays, and I've never met anyone. So I'm a people person, but that's sort of been really challenging to me, is pretending I know who I'm speaking to, because we have a culture of no cameras. So I don't know what these people look like. I don't know their names. So yeah, I don't know if anyone would have answers, or if anyone's been in a similar situation, just to kind of get some advice or guidance. But it's something I'm really struggling with that, and I don't want to offend anyone, obviously. And I've been in the company now for nearly 9 months. So I kind of feel like my excuse is, that I'm new, is fading away, and I need to actually, I don't know, meet these people.
That's a thing, hey?
Yeah.
Because they know who you are by process of elimination, probably.
One new person, whereas I'm meeting 60 plus people.
So your kind of socialization process has changed radically.
Yeah, and it really makes me think about people who are inducted or orientated as a new person. And when Chris was talking about culture, for me, I hear people talking about what the culture used to be like versus the culture that I'm aware of and know. And they obviously have their issues and challenges around that. And then sort of the culture that I know and how they are different, how they're the same. Yeah, there's a little bit of complexity in that.
Yeah, I mean, the change in cultures overnight.
Yeah.
It's been amazing. Amazing how, and if it wasn't actively managed, it can go pear quite easily. And
I can't relate to the old culture, the things that they are connecting on and miss, I don't relate to, I can't, understand, or so it also creates an interesting dynamic in trying to establish relationships, because I only know what I know, and it's different to what they know.
It's really interesting. So there's a disruption in how people understand the organization. The stories that they tell don't ring true. All of the old narratives don't make sense.
Yeah.
Is it a bit like the sort of when we's? You remember? Maybe
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And sort of longing to bring those bits back, maybe.
Yep. And then also being grateful for the job I have, and and then there's almost this sadness on their part and almost this excitement that I bring, and so we kind of miss, and it makes it difficult to relate when you're connecting with people.
So you've walked into a kind of a deathbed, and everyone is grieving,
and I'm excited and energized. So yeah, you miss, and I have to balance my energy a little bit and really try and listen and understand what their culture was like and what they are missing. Yeah, it can be quite heavy sometimes.
Yeah, in the graveyard. So I don't know if you're okay with this. I don't know if this will work, but I've got...
Alistair's got his hand up.
Alistair, thank you. Talk to me.
Thanks, Simon. So on the question of why I joined, I thought it was a discussion on relationships, like romantic relationships. Only because I was listening to a podcast the other day about this topic. So now that I've read the email again and I've heard your contributions, we won't talk about that. What?
No, we can. That is on the table. That's why I left it ambiguous, because I wanted to see where you wanted to go.
No, I think everyone knows that that's a dangerous territory. So I'll go more on the technical side of the topic.
Go for the danger, Alistair.
Technical, please, then danger later. So I follow, this David Rock guy from the Neuro Leadership Institute, and I think you've referenced him in your book as well. And their model on the brain is like the brain is always assessing threats. So they came up with a SCARF model. So your S is your status threats, C is certainty, A is autonomy, R is relatedness, F is fairness. Okay, so I'll talk about autonomy because they had a big webcast on that. And they were saying that human beings are more productive when the autonomy threat is low. So now remote work has made people more creative, more, more willing to, more productive, right? So now there comes a threat when I think now people are moving back to offices and that autonomy threat is like high at the moment. And in the US, they've had what they call the Great Resignation. I think in April, over 1 million people resigned because bosses were like, come back to work. And you've robbed somebody of, a major part of themselves. So yeah, that's what's coming up for me in terms of relationships. Now, as a manager, and you're probably getting pressure from wherever, I don't know, to get people back into the office. But then at the same time, you're robbing them of their autonomy. You're increasing autonomy risk. And then the people are just resigning even, and I'm seeing it with some of my friends, they're already threatening, like, I'm not going back to the office. Yeah. But the funny part is this, they party on weekends, but they don't want to go to the office using the COVID card. So at the end of the day, you need to be realistic and realize you're dealing with human beings whose brains are constantly assessing these threats. So this autonomy thing for the neuro leadership people, it's like a big, big research area for them, saying, just make sure you manage it well, particularly when it's about transitioning back to the offices. But I think people have really enjoyed this remote work era because they now have that control. And if I link it to, I think, what we spoke about the other day on self-praise, it's like everybody's self-praise is like off the charts. Everybody's doing what is best for themselves. So yeah, that's my bit on the technical side, nothing on the love side. Sorry.
Nothing on the love side. I'm busy typing it in here. And I'm hoping that my sense making it makes sense to you. And then we can change this. It's saying that name is just too long. So I really like what you say about autonomy. Not only because it's a neuroscience thing, but it's also an existential thing. And in the world of existential thinking, there's this whole thing about balancing isolation or autonomy and attachment, and myself and others, and freedom and control. It's all sort of bound up together. And I think, as you say, that needle was reset. And now people don't want to go back. And I think that's really interesting. So, yeah, I've got some stuff here and I'm looking for your lead. I'm going to create rooms with names and then you go off to that room. If no one goes to a room, it just means there was no energy there today. see. Yeah. Okay, sorry. So I've got here something about intimate relationships. What happens when they happen at work? And I think maybe that topic we could include, we can include intimate relationships, but maybe also all the underground stuff that happens in relationships. Is that a bit too much of a thing, Simon?
Depends what the other rooms are.
Okay. Well, we can change them. So we just leave that. I'm just going to put you intimate, okay, underground, okay. Then I've got a room called autonomy, which is that whole business of what Alistair was talking about. Then I've got objects, tools, projection screen, competitors, and attachment, pattern, because I couldn't fit the full word pattern in, so it's not a typo, just effing YI. And then I thought of having a room called grieving, which is broadly to Aileen's conversation. What do you do when the whole business is grieving for some loss? I've just also been noticing how many people have lost people and how the grief thing is so incredibly all-encompassing and extensive. Loss of life, loss of connections, loss of relationships. The whole loss and grieving thing is enormous. So that's 4. What do you think of those 4? So we've got all the underground psychological dynamics, including intimate relationships. You can take it wherever you like in the room if you go there. The issue of autonomy, the issue of objects, tools, bringing less of yourself to work, getting more competitive, removal of hidden rituals of connection. So the whole kind of dehumanization process, for want of a better word. And then something around how relationships operate in grieving environments. So underground psychological dynamics, autonomy, objects, and grieving. Is that enough? Too much, too little? Give me some signaling.
I think you might find a lot of the group going to 1, but that's, again, maybe just my stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's see.
What do you, are you giving me the thumbs up, or you just, what's happening in there?
Sorry, Julia, I'm not quite clear. Are you saying that there's a choice, or you're going to just put us in a room with a topic?
There's a choice. It's going to ask you to choose.
Oh, okay.
And in that choice, we'll see where the energy lies for the conversation today.
Okay.
What we
can you perhaps just put the group names in the chat so that we can just identify it from the chat?
It's the group name is in the options.
Oh.
Yeah. So it will offer you those things that I said.
Okay.
Objects, autonomy, and underground and intimate relationships at work.
Okay.
And maybe just to fill about with you a little bit, I would like you to do something which might be a little bit irritating. Sorry. But maybe let's have a small moment of closing our eyes, and we're going to try now go for some heart work today. And I want you to close your eyes and have a think. Slowly come into your body, feel yourself, ground yourself, and have a conversation about which one of these subjects is most important to your heart now. psychological dynamics in relationships at work, your own personal autonomy, being an object, or what it's like to work with grieving people. Alrighty, so I'm going to open the rooms and I'm going to give you 30 minutes. I got some really interesting feedback the other day about these breakaway groups. And somebody said, you know, sometimes we don't even talk about the topic. What I really like is just finding out who's there. And I'm building relationships. And I just want to say, you can do that. That is cool. It's up to you. So if you feel 30 minutes is too long, have other discussions. Do what's right for you. Misery, what's the thing, Simon? Pain is inevitable. Misery is optional. So I'll see you in 30 minutes. Are you getting the options? No. So go to breakout rooms. Can you see what's happening here? Okay, some people are, it's moving.
How do I actually choose it?
I think it just, is there a thing to click on there?
Doesn't want to go anywhere.
Where do you want to go? I'll send you.
I want to go to the objects, tools, projections.
Good. I'm sending you to assign to objects, tools, and you should be moving off shortly. Alida, I am sending you off to, because you're Enneagram 4, you're going to grieving. maybe grief. Do you want to go off as the biggest grouping? Or, so Krista had to go to do a live club. Now it's up to you to do that. Feedback, Simon. So does
Well, no, you were there too for 95% of it.
It's true. So should we start with grief?
I think we were all as curious as you as to why there's so many of us. So what we did was to start by saying why we're there. Why did we choose the room?
How many people went to grief?
7.
7. Wow.
And it was a mix of, because it's all around us and it's bigger than it was before. On the other hand, also having to deal with it ourselves from different perspectives. And then there was a bit of, how do we use that language with clients if they're uncomfortable with it? If we know they have to deal with grief, but they go, like a client said to me last week, I know it's inappropriate to talk about grief in exco settings, you know. So how do you, if you're uncomfortable with language like loss and grief and trauma, then how do we bring that in? Yeah.
Why do you think people are uncomfortable talking about that stuff?
I think it's cultural in many organizations that if you don't talk about the heavy, difficult, deep stuff, that conversations are superficial, and not necessarily work related is one of the reasons. Another one might be that you're so bloody scared that you start crying and you don't want to cry in front of your colleagues. I don't know. Other people from the grief room? I'm going to shut up.
Yeah, now. I think my own observation is that, especially I think before the pandemic, so many people are in complete denial of their mortality. So it is a topic that's avoided. It's certainly not a dinner time conversation.
Unless you're hanging out with existential philosophers, in which case it really is. This is that, you know, in cycles of life and death, it's during the cycle of death that existential philosophers really find their feet. Sorry, I'm being cynical. But yeah, I think people have huge difficulty talking about it. And anybody else want to add in there before I throw something in? Elida?
So, I mean, I work in a place where death is a reality and has always been, but there's still a huge amount of denial around it.
Yes, fatalities, not dead people.
Yes. And you don't deal with grief and loss and trauma, you throw admin and paperwork at it and cover each other's asses. And then also not just the loss of life, but also loss of the way things were. And not for us so much in the sense of, working from home and so on, because we didn't do that. But a loss of a culture we were used to. And I think the fact that nobody's actually dealing with that shared trauma, you can actually see how relationships at work are breaking down badly. But nobody talks about it because there's no trauma on a mine ever.
No trauma. And I mean, the other thing is, if you have a kind of a habit of avoiding talking about death, you never learn stamina and language around talking about death. So your capacity is so limited, it has to build up over years. And we don't know how to process death, most people. So it kind of lurks, it hangs around. The Grim Reaper is always with us, instead of getting processed and moved on.
And yet it is suggested that the more okay we are with death, the happier our daily life is.
Exactly. That's why we need little skulls on our desk to remind us of death. Yeah. You know, like the old the philosophers from old, you know, talking to the dead skull. Lisa, what does your cat think?
This is Charlie, everyone. He loves Zoom meetings. It just started drizzling, and I think it's the first rains in Gauteng in like 5-6 months, and I'm not used to it, so I need to quickly go take a few things out of the rain. I'll be back in a second.
Yeah, go. Okay. So, any more inputs from the grief group? What strikes me is this, that we're building a climate of stuckness in organizations where people are operating from a past or a longing. And if we can't process the grief, then it's going to make us really hard to stay relevant and to be in the future. So how do we do this as coaches and group workers? How do we process grief? Did you have any conversation about that? No.
Yeah, I think what we spoke of there, Julia, is really that whole concept of creating the psychological safety. And you know, Liesel spoke quite a bit of her, you know, some of her clients, as did a leader in her organization, where it's not, there's no appetite for discussing it. And in my experience, it's so much leadership driven. It has to come from the top. And a lovely case study I have is with a client of mine where I was asked to specifically have the facilitation with managers around how do you deal with that first conversation when your employee tells you they've lost a dear one. How do you do that? So the consciousness of doing that is what's needed. And I think the tone of that is set from the top.
Beautiful. That is beautiful. And so necessary. I remember Adam Cook, who's not here today, and he was saying that he used to organize these talks and sort of pre-COVID, you know, few people came, 20. And then he had a session on trauma and death, and like 400 people came. So there's a desire to learn it, but I suppose it's the languaging, as you say, Lee, and somebody has to stand up and take a position. Thank you. Cool. So the autonomy group. Zero. That's right. Yeah, how interesting. Okay. And then there were 3 people in the tools, objects, and, you know, sort of progressive dehumanization kind of discussion group. What happened there?
I'm happy to kick
Miss Sivanda, welcome.
Is it you who changed me, Julia?
No, who was that? Got married recently.
Thank you to that person.
Who was that? Simon, was it you?
All right, it just suddenly changed. My word, the machine is watching me. I need to get off Zoom. The man. Cool. So we went to quite a few interesting places with it. But one thing that struck me, like boom, I'm like sitting with it in my face, is something Sarah Ann mentioned. And Sarah Ann, I'll allow you to tell the story, but she shared her niece's experience. Can I ask for your permission to tell it lightly? Okay, thank you. She shared the experience of her niece who's just written prelims and was right about marks. But what was interesting is that the maths teacher mentioned to them that the parts that they did on Zoom versus the parts which they learned in person, everyone did much better in the parts that they learned in person versus the parts that they learned in Zoom. And that took us to a place of, you know, what are the things that we're not even aware of that are slipping in this time? And I think that's really sat with me, that as we are behind the screen, as we are cameras off, as we are learning to be more muted, as we are, you know, the system's objectifying, but in some ways we're also objectifying ourselves by making up some stories about, what do I think about Julia if she doesn't put her camera on? And I don't think to myself, oh, maybe it's because Julia lives in Soweto and just bandwidth is horrible no matter what, you know? So there's also those kind of stories I'm telling myself in my home. And what's slipping that we don't know about? It's slipping in young children, you know, and how they build relationships. But it's also slipping in adults, in how we build trust, how we build relationships, and just how depersonalized it all is. And then another place we went to is kind of how people have changed over this time, but how do they bring in their transitioning authentic selves into the workplaces in this Zoom context or in this hybrid model. So I have a particular client who is a 3, and I think she's tipping over into post-con. And at work, she was just a star, you know, just a shiny plastic statue. And she's no longer that person. And she's now struggling to kind of reintroduce this transitioning person who doesn't want to perform at all costs, who doesn't think being the star is worth everything anymore. And the system knows her from Jan 2020. So the system's just like, you're our superstar. And she's like, that doesn't attract me anymore. So instead of running away and resigning, we're working on how do you bring in your authenticity.
Wow, that rings so true for me. I had a client in America, exactly the same story. COVID just catapulted her into post-conventional ways of thinking, and now she doesn't know what to do with herself.
Yeah.
Wow.
Cool. I'll let the other team members jump in now.
Wow.
Yes, we also spoke about patterns where we said some unhealthy patterns were formed or are formed where people actually really push the boundaries, and the work-life balance is distorted where it's long hours. Also now having access to global meetings, global conversations, you move into another time zone and you find that you sit at 11 at night still stuck in front of Zoom, and it became the norm. But it's really affecting relationships at home, also sleep patterns and healthy patterns that we see forming. We are less mobile, less active. We find that people sometimes complain about not having a good posture in front of their computer the whole day, not having enough time to do exercises, not attending a gym anymore, and really gaining weights, and nothing fits, and don't feel good about yourself. So we see health becomes an issue. There are a lot of health issues. People feel frustrated and also more snappy. They yes, it's a bit touchy sometimes. So we spoke a little bit about those unhealthy patterns that we see forming. And also in terms of, if we talk about, just our defense mechanisms, all of that, how that all of a sudden is quite visible. Probably people feel a bit traumatized, and we see those patterns also surfacing.
Did you have any conversation about competitiveness and whether you think there's a shift around that? I see Alice is giving the nod.
No, we haven't really spoken about competitiveness, but maybe in some of the other groups.
Yeah. I wonder if that increases when you have, I mean, when people are more dehumanized.
So I don't know whether it links into the competitiveness, but one of the things that I was reminded of was Brené Brown's point that, you know, to check with ourselves, what is the story I'm telling myself, and how, you know, arriving back at work, we tell ourselves certain stories about, you know, oh, I've obviously slipped off, or I'm going to be much better now, or, you know, so yeah, what do we bring in terms of our own object relation stuff, around who the other people are, you know, whether we're showing up or not showing up, whether that's on Zoom or in person, and the transition between the two. So really checking in, you know, is the competitiveness a story we're telling ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, but you know what is so fascinating is that you have to be quite skillful to do that. And if we use the maturity curve as a kind of a indication of percentages of people that might have this level of skill, I would imagine, like, we're talking about, so if we say it kind of only comes in specializing, then a little bit more at achieving. Simon, what's achieving again? 12%.
What? Sorry.
So I'm trying to figure out how many people
30.
would 30. So 50. So 50% of people would have that skill to be able to question. I mean, I don't know, I'm being generous. Simon, what do you think? You know about this stuff? So most people wouldn't be able to query their narrative. They would think it's truth.
From performing and later, they would.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I shared with Simon when we chatted once my theory about pink salt, and my theory is long story.
I've used it. I stole it and I've used it, but I have referenced you.
So my theory is that you know, life events can put you in a situation where your normal, you assume, is everyone's normal. So the situation that led to the pink salt part was our daughter was sick when she was very young, and part of a health move, we discovered pink salt, and clearly that was much better for us. So we used pink salt. And when we emerged from her treatment process, I realized other people weren't using pink salt. And I found that really strange, because clearly it was better for you. So I have a pink salt theory, is that when we normalize things in our lives and we surround ourselves with people that speak the same language, we get a surprise. We're shocked that other people don't use pink salt. And again, you were saying existentially people talk about death. And when people were saying you don't, I was thinking, gosh, people don't talk about death. How interesting is that? You know, so we assume, and certainly in the context that I work, you know, the conversation around what story are you telling yourself is a thing. So yes, I understand that maybe that's pink salt, and not everyone is reflecting on their own story.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the big learning, like survival and thriving in this new environment is all about querying our story and being vulnerable to enough to ask, you know, how does it work for you?
And I think that's one thing we did touch on in our group, was saying, you know, we're spending a lot of time at work ourselves, normalizing things for other people. You know, so in this process of going back to work, in our normal work relationships, what is normal? You know, is it okay to feel sad at work now? Well, yes, it is, because, you know, 3 family members have passed away, and it would be abnormal for you to hide that. So yes, it might have boundaries, but actually it's normal to feel this way. It's normal to express this within this way.
Yeah. Really interesting and useful tips on what we should be doing to support people. Normalizing, helping them query their story, being curious. Really useful. Thank you. Any other comments on that? Oh, let's go to race. So, you know, the one kind of version of racism is turning people who are different from you into objects. And I don't know if we can find an answer to this, but if there is dehumanization as a result of more Zoom relationships, is this having an impact on cross-cultural and interracial relationships that are conducted on Zoom? Just wondering.
I think we didn't go there, but I think what an interesting question, Julia. And I think especially when I put in the layer of South Africa on top of it, and just how kind of geographically people are split up, and what are the amenities available in different areas. You know, so is there fiber? Is there not fiber? That kind of simple question is so geographically, and you can map that racially in our country still. Mm-hmm. So I can absolutely see how it can increase that, because if you can't perform with seamless camera on, Zoom on performance, then your output looks less, you know, or your output, it looks like you're not making enough of an effort, or your ability to connect and kind of for people to see you and know your face is just compromised. And there's nothing you can do about it. And this country in particular, it's so mapped with race that consciously or subconsciously, it will have an effect with how organizations, I mean, there's a client of mine who manages the learnership program in a particular organization. And now they've decided to stop the learnership program because many of the learners live in townships. And despite the companies giving them dongles and stuff like that, there's just connectivity issues which are out of their control. So now that company is less integrated with young Black youth, you know, than before, and is contributing less to the development of Black youth in this country versus what they were doing in 2019. And these are like, I think, the ripple effects that we're still even to see, because will they go back to learnerships now, or have they just found a way to like make the system more efficient, and therefore learnerships will no more be a thing, you know?
That's huge and incredibly interesting. Thank you. Really, really useful. And I'm coming to you, Ingrid. Thank you. I just want to say like that Sarah Ann comment about, you know, making up stories about people and then not having the courage to check them out. Well, that seems to happen more in intercultural or cross-racial relationships. So that would feed into this increased distance between races. Yeah.
And to add on to what Nchatamba said, is we also spoke about...
Elmin, Ingrid, was yours related to Chachamba or a new subject?
Mine?
Ingrid's comment, because she's been sitting waiting.
It was related to Chachambo's comment.
Okay, so then we'll come to you afterwards, Elmin. Sorry, thank you. Yeah,
thanks. I think that the other variables that compromise people in this space are not just stress, but very much their life circumstances. Single parents, very compromised, parents of young children. So I've been in client settings where, you know, people try to have tolerance for a single parent with young children, but at some point the compassion wears out because they're also in a compressed window of tolerance for stress, and you know, handling the impact on someone's performance is something that they won't do for very long. So yeah.
So minority groups potentially polarized. Thank you. Great insight there. Elmin.
Thank you. Also, just to add on to what Nchatamba said, like your learners at school, also with all their challenges with data and parents not really being so well informed about all these virtual tools, lots of them have dropped out. And once again, it is that polarization that we see. And the demographics.
And Lee's son, who I imagine had reasonable access to Wi-Fi, he left as well. And it's not just a demographic thing, I would suggest.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, a privileged white boy, it was very traumatic for us as a family. He was still having good results, but the anxiety of learning in this way and just very poor support, because those tutors are not familiar with this kind of learning. So so one has empathy for them as well. But it had really had a very traumatic effect on the whole family. Because, you know, failure like that for a young student is not easy. And so we were just blessed. As I say, he's studying to be a farmer, and he's now a trainee irrigation manager on a blueberry farm. So
beautiful. Can we get a lot of blueberries? I adore them. Lovely. So there's so much depth in this conversation, and so much, so many insights that we can gain. But I think I would be doing you all a disservice if I was going to leave 6 out of this conversation. And so maybe for the next 10 minutes we can talk about 6, Simon.
Okay, it's my cue. You were there too. Christo was there, but has buggered off. We started off by questioning why Eros is banned from organizations, for example. What is it about romantic relationships and alliances at work that is so frowned upon? And we kind of came up with the power and the abuse aspect of it. So, and we talked about Mad Men. You go back to kind of the 60s where, you know, if you weren't having sex with your secretary, then you were considered weird or homosexual as a male boss, those dark days. But we kind of sat over and above that, sat with that question for quite a while and really wondered. And I'm almost inclined to kind of throw it into the group and say, why do we think that romantic alliances are taboo or frowned upon or outlawed actually in some organizations? What's that about? I'm curious. What do you think? Ingrid, you're okay. Sorry, I heard somebody else on mute, but I'm just laughing at Ingrid's laughter.
Just hilarious, the very question. I don't know if you want to go first, Lee, but the instant thing I'm having is flashbacks to my first job, where I had a romantic involvement with somebody for about 6 weeks. A peer. He's slightly more senior than me, but it was an utter disaster, and I fled the relationship in horror. And then going back to work and having him sitting in the office opposite mine was so distressing that I used to sneak into my office and try not to, you know, see him or make eye contact. And it was difficult to be in the same meeting room as him after that. I most certainly wouldn't have been able to collaborate with him on a project without, you know, being emotionally derailed. So I think, you know, romantic involvement, it could be stable and fine, but I don't think that's the rule. And when the relationship goes wrong, it severely impacts people's ability to function and be productive.
So it's from the organization's perspective, it's the productive performance aspects of it.
Well, personally as well. I mean, it was
Yes.
a very, very unpleasant experience for me to be in that working environment after I left the relationship with such intense anxiety and concerns for my psychological safety. So I'd made myself vulnerable to somebody in a way that really made me unsafe in the subsequent working environment. And I think it's very wise to avoid work relationships.
Mm.
That's my 2 cents.
Anyone else was lining up to comment?
It's Lee and
Yeah.
Sabine.
So Simon, having had 30 years as an HR director in corporate, lust in the workplace is not a good idea. I've seen too much suffering, both from the individual's perspective and the organization. But having said that, before the pandemic, we spend most of our waking hours at work. So people fall in love at work.
Mm.
And I think it just has to be navigated. But I completely agree with Ingrid. It creates so many complexities. And of course, we have power issues where it can very easily go into sexual harassment.
Yep.
And that becomes
totally
a whole other big suffering.
Mm.
Over to Sabine.
I'm one of the other scenarios where I was terrified of landing in the awkward aftermath where everything just backfires. But I actually found my life partner at work and we both tried to ignore that for a year because we were so terrified of what would happen if it didn't go right. And I think the chances of it not ending well are maybe higher than it ending well. But I'm really intrigued by this question because from my own experience in the workplace, I feel like relationships have become so depersonalized and I don't really understand. I mean, I guess I'm just adding another why question, but why are relationships at work so separate in the way that we treat them from relationships in our personal life? And I think both could definitely benefit from mixing a little bit. So maybe on the one side, personally, more like boundaries, and then in the workplace, definitely a little bit more around something with Eros at least. So I appreciate this theme.
Yeah, because in the absence of Eros, if you're Freudian anyway, all you're left with is Thanatos, which is death, the death drive. If there's no life force. Anyway, what's left? So we talked about that a fair bit, and we did come up with some of those reasons why there shouldn't be relationships at work. It wasn't like we were blindly thinking that it should be advocated.
Maybe just to add one more thing, like one reflection that just came to mind is at the time when I was just thinking, like, imagine if we would date and, we would start this. And I definitely did have the consideration that it would look worse on me as a woman than on him as a man if it would come out or, if there would be any negative effect. So that's definitely something there too.
Yeah, agreed. We then talked a little bit about the sort of the transference aspects to relationships at work and the way that sometimes people seek out patterns from their childhood. So had an abusive father and then end up having a series of abusive bosses, and how the kind of compulsion to repeat can often cause us to gravitate towards certain scenarios in the workplace. And we all shared a little bit sort of personal stuff around that. And mine has always certainly been to gravitate towards powerful, emotional women over the course of my life, which is very much informed by my early relationship with my mother. So that was quite interesting. And the extent to which that isn't surfaced and it isn't talked about in organizations. Again, it's almost like a kind of taboo subject, and we raise it actively in our programs and try to bring it in as much as possible because there are expectations that are just beyond appropriate often with people in the workplace and what they expect from bosses, from peers, because of early relationships. So they're always in, I think, is probably a summation of what we talked about, but they're often not seen and not worked with. And then the last bit, which we didn't get to, which I think would be useful, I mean, it's a different discussion probably, is how relationships and sex kind of enters the the coaching space or the therapy space. And I think we've touched on it in a previous session, Julia, is that right?
Yeah, I think I
But
did
it was a long while ago.
Sexual attraction in coaching relationship.
Yeah, and there is a body of literature on this, but it's quite sparse, I think it's fair to say. And the extent to which that we as practitioners need to be aware of that and how it shows up in the coaching relationship or the therapy relationship. And how little that's worked with actually with practitioners. So in supervision, it's always something that we try and work actively with. It's like, so what is this client? Who is this client to you? What comes up for you? What's evoked? Because it's always going to be in the space. And we didn't get much time to talk about that, but I think that's another manifestation of relationships at work for us as practitioners.
Yeah, I mean, therapists do extensive supervision around that, and somehow coaches think that they're immune from it. It's really an absolute, what's the word, blind spot for coaches. Oh, that man I'm coaching, oh, he flirts with me, so I let him get away with stuff or whatever. Yeah. Thank you, Simon, for that really good wrap up. There's one bit I want to add.
Yes, because you were there too.
Yeah. So recently I found this really controversial and troublesome, difficult person who's like a spiritual teacher but doesn't want to be called that. So what I'm saying is, I'm going to give you a name now. I'm not saying I agree with what this person says. I'm just saying they are curious. And this person's name is Swan Teal. Now, Sabine, if you're in the States, you might know about her. So, okay. So she...
No and no.
You know about her?
No, as in like I'm not in the States and I don't know about her.
Oh, where are you?
I'm in the Netherlands. I'm in Amsterdam.
Ah, I saw your surname and then your accent. I didn't know which one to go for. Okay, so here is a person that's really, really quite strange. So her background is satanic ritualistic abuse. Now, I know it's a big theme in this country that people that kind of whatever. So I'm just saying we're talking a little bit cray here. But if you're up for cray, she has a really useful video, I think, on sexual fantasies on YouTube. And so there's been a lot of research into why we choose certain sexual fantasies, why we might have a fantasy about the office or about being controlled or about beating people up or whatever. So what I found interesting about her was that she talks quite explicitly about fantasies as revealing where you want to go and the issue that you're dealing with at the moment. And I love to share new stuff, and we were talking about sex, and so I threw this in. I just think it was absolutely fascinating because a lot of writers about fantasy pathologize fantasies. But what if we were to work with them as revealing something about ourselves where we want to emerge? So one of the examples she gave was it was women, very controlling women, she says, often have fantasies about being controlled. And so this is like sex as timeout, as wanting to have a more kind of a balanced life. Anyway, go and look if you're interested. Just saying. But, caveats. I'm not saying she's totally 100% sane. So, well done. It was quite an adventure today with many different subjects. Mrs. Sibanda, we're still waiting for you to come with your date. So now turn to public shaming. Do you notice?
I'm going to go camera off now, just to disconnect from you, you know?
Exactly. Learn me a lesson. Learn me. So we're not sure about next week, but we'll let you know. We've got some other speakers, including Jonathan Reams, coming up, and we hope to have a party at the end of November. So thank you so much for all your contributions for today, and have a good evening. Yeah, we're all on the same time zone. No Americans. Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. See you all.
I want to ask if somebody can share the link of the video that we started with.